I've been trying to figure out how to start this story for several months. Actually, it's more like several years. I've had this on my mind for almost a decade. I guess the best way to explain everything is to start at the very beginning. 2010. After almost 4 years of hard work from Monolith Soft, Xenoblade had finally been released in Japan. And gamers are loving it. Gamers from outside of Japan are hearing all the praise, and now they're excited. They want to play the game in English. They want to know when they'll get their turns. Initially, it didn't seem like Nintendo was too interested in that idea. Something changed, though. Maybe it was fan support, and maybe Nintendo planned to do it all along, but Xenoblade was released in the rest of the world 2 years later. Interestingly, in the United States, GameStop was chosen as the sole retail distributor for Xenoblade's very limited run, so you needed to pre-order on there or on Nintendo's website. It was such an odd choice, but I guess as long as the game was available, it didn't matter too much. People wanted this game very badly from what I understand, and not every pre-order was able to be fulfilled. Eventually, Xenoblade's initial release came and went, but that's not the end of the story. Not by a long shot. Let me tell you about how I got my copy of Xenoblade for the Wii. I was a teenager at the time, and I had just received my first ever paycheck from my first ever legit job. I had promised myself that I would use that specific paycheck on anything I wanted, and then the later ones I would begin saving in the bank. So I did what any self-respecting gamer in 2013 would do, and I headed straight to my local GameStop. I browsed the racks and looked for something, well, anything interesting. I had quite the collection at the time, so it was hard to find something I didn't have. I was in the Wii section, scanning my eyes through the alphabetically organized used area. Usually when I get lower in the racks, I just kinda give up and move on. Like, honestly, what games start with the letter X or the letter Z? But that day I didn't stop looking. I don't know why, I just didn't. And then I saw it. A single copy of Xenoblade. I had never actually seen one in person. I knew that it was pretty rare and had come out fairly recently. I also knew that people liked it, so that was enough to convince me to at least pick it up off the shelf. And when I did, I was in for a major surprise. $90. I had never seen a game that expensive in person at that point, especially a used one. I guess it at least had the case and manual and looked to be in very nice condition, but it was still out of the ordinary. At this time, Wii games were going for about $50 new. I was so confused. I asked the nearby employee, who happened to be the manager at the time, if this was possibly a mistake. He looked at it and said, "Oh wow, that's a rare game. That's why." Still in disbelief, I checked my phone and sure enough, this game was expensive. I remember standing in that store for 20 minutes, contemplating my choice. Do I really spend $90 of my hard-earned money on this game? That's almost this entire paycheck. The reviews are so good though. I couldn't decide. I will never forget what happened next though. I had wandered kind of close to the checkout area at this point, and the employee I had spoken to earlier said something to me. He said, "Listen, if you don't buy this game, I'm going to when my shift is over." That was enough to spook me. I dropped $90 on this game. What else was I supposed to do? I didn't think I would ever see it again. I also remember while checking out, the girl next to him behind the counter asked if it was a golf game. I don't know why, but that's always stuck with me too. I checked out and went home. Fast forward a couple days and I was in the area again, so I just stopped by the GameStop for a second time that week to see if anything new was in. I headed to the Wii section, and to my utter disbelief, Another copy of Xenoblade was in place of my old one. And it wasn't just one, 3 were sitting there. I spoke to the employee at the desk, this guy was different by the way, and I asked about the game. I thought Xenoblade was rare. There was only one here the other day. The employee looked confused and said I might be mistaken. He said they had stacks of this game in the back. It was at this moment that I realized something much bigger was going on. Something was wrong. When I got home, I did some research, and very quickly, I noticed other people had experienced the same thing. Used copies of Xenoblade for $90 have been popping up all across the country. Looking deeper, I realized I had been scammed. We all had been scammed. Scammed by the largest video game retailer in the world. I know that this is just my experience, and it doesn't necessarily reflect the way everyone else got their copies, but something like this happened to a lot of people if there are this many articles talking about it. I'm curious to know how many of you have weird GameStop stories, considering most people have almost always regarded them as shady for as long as I can remember. Moving on, let's dive in and figure out what happened here. Let's look at the facts. As previously stated, GameStop had exclusive retail rights to sell Xenoblade in the US. People pre-order, and then GameStop sells out of their copies. Alright, simple enough. But if quantities of this game are so limited, then why all of a sudden, in the summer of 2013, are tons of used copies of this game popping up? I don't know about you, but I doubt that thousands or even hundreds of people were actively trading in Xenoblade to GameStops around the country. There's just no way. Here's what probably happened. You may not have heard of them, but GameQuest Direct is a company that has infamously reprinted rare games in the past. Normally, reprinting games is something most gamers want. A game that is typically hard to find is now easier to find, right? The issue is there is little to no indication that the copy you have is a reprint by them. There are multiple problems with this. If the reprint isn't publicly announced, having a large number of copies injected into the gaming market can easily cause people to spend a large amount of money on them without realizing. After all, it's a rare game. When are you going to see it again? Another issue is that some gamers don't want a reprint, they want the original, and that's something I understand myself as a collector. From what I found, it's not officially confirmed, but very likely that GameStop cut a deal with GameQuest Direct to reprint copies of Xenoblade. Okay, this makes sense. Now there are more copies, so people are more likely to trade them in, right? Wrong. This is the part that drove people mad. They just weren't pre-owned. These copies were all brand new. Something to understand about running a retail business is that most items have what's called an MSRP. This means manufacturer's suggested retail price. Essentially, when a new video game comes out, it costs about $60 USD pretty much everywhere. There are a few exceptions like Walmart, where some games are sold for $50 or less. What's a little weird is when a business sells a game above the MSRP. While the MSRP is a suggestion, any company that works with a distributor is well within their rights to terminate their deal if they see that their MSRP is not being followed. This is completely fair. They want items to be sold at certain prices for a reason, and if a distributor isn't adhering to their business model, they can just say, okay, see ya. This is the key to answering our last question. Why were these reprints labeled as pre-owned? GameStop ordered thousands of these new copies of Xenoblade. When they got to the stores, the shrink wrap was allegedly removed or just never present at all. Because of this, they considered the games used rather than new. So now they were free to set the prices at whatever they wanted without the fear that the Nintendo ninjas would come knocking on their doors. This is the same business model they use when they take in pre-owned games, but instead of lowering the price, they increased it. What makes this even more deplorable is that Xenoblade specifically was a game that only they were selling. You really couldn't get it anywhere else at this point, unless you went on eBay or some other auction site. You had to go through them to get these new copies. And people caught on very quickly. Gamers were noticing this huge spike in available used copies in pristine condition. Even more ridiculous was that many people who got a used copy of Xenoblade at this time reported that the Club Nintendo code wasn't even used, lending even more credence to the ideas that these games were actually new. GameStop did this. GameStop was responsible for this black market, back alley drug deal tactic that almost hinges on market manipulation. The worst part is, it's not the only time they've done something like this. This NeoGAF thread has a pretty decent list of games that GameQuest Direct and other manufacturers have most likely reprinted in the past. Now, information on these is a little scarce since most of these games are from more than 10 years ago, but I did look into it, and I found claims that a large amount of these were reprinted, some of which were only sent to GameStop. There were a few cases where I had even read about situations similar to Xenoblade's where a used sticker was slapped on a brand new looking copy. Now, am I saying that GameStop did this with every single one of these games? No, I'm not going to assume that because that would be unfair. What I will say is, they did it once, and they certainly did it again. This user on Reddit describes an almost identical story to my own, but this time with Metroid Prime Trilogy. Metroid Prime Trilogy, for those unaware, was a special release for the Wii that included all 3 mainline Prime games with new motion controls. I know that it sounds bad, but honestly, I find these to be the best versions of each game. Anyway, this was a very desirable game. According to the Redditor, the employee pretended like he didn't know there were extra copies, but there was actually a stack of them behind the desk. To be fair, Metroid Prime Trilogy's reprint was announced and lacked the steelbook case that came with the original, so it was very easy to tell. However, these reprints were still being marked as used, and the employee was still manipulating the customer. If you weren't aware that the original had a steelbook, it's something you could have fallen for. I'm not going to sit here and show you every instance of GameStop pulling something like this. This is just another example of this particular scam in action. I think what I'm trying to say is, just be careful at GameStop. Eventually, GameStop came out and admitted it. They had gotten Xenoblade reprinted. This is a press release they made after getting bombarded with complaints. GameStop regularly receives feedback from our Power Up Rewards members regarding old titles they would like us to bring back, such as vintage games like Xenoblade Chronicles. We were recently able to source a limited number of copies of this title to carry in our stores and online. In fact, we have sourced several more vintage titles that will be hitting stores in the coming months, including Metroid Prime Trilogy. As always, our pricing for these games is competitive and based on current market value driven by supply and demand. Power Up Pro members always receive a 10% discount and earn Power Up Rewards points on pre-owned purchases. What the heck? Current market value? They caused the current market value. They also completely glossed over the morally questionable practice of labeling a brand new game as pre-owned. How could you just pretend like all of that wasn't a big deal? This all happened years ago, but it still grinds my gears. It's simply dishonest, and it bugs me. Even though Xenoblade is and will continue to be my favorite game, I can't deny that the acquisition of my copy has always bothered me at some level. Some defenders of the situation say that many people would not have gotten to play Xenoblade had it not been reprinted. And I've even heard the sentiment that the controversy helped Xenoblade's brand recognition significantly, and the game became much cheaper after the controversy came to light as well. Xenoblade ended up dropping down to $40 along with Metroid Prime Trilogy, and it could have made the series a lot more accessible. And that's all probably true. I don't know if I would have gotten into Xenoblade had things not happened this way. And if I did, it would have been many years later, probably with the release of Definitive Edition. I wouldn't have discovered this vast world that some of my favorite characters in media are a part of. I wouldn't have been able to watch as this small community exploded in size, getting larger and larger with each game release. I wouldn't have started this channel and made all this content that I'm genuinely proud of. And I wouldn't have met all of you and been able to receive your continued support with each upload. The course of my life would have been completely different. And it's all because of GameStop. So I guess I really should be saying, thank you, GameStop. Nah, I'm just kidding. Fuck you, you bunch of rats.